This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Israel responds to Nepal's massive earthquake. Plus, how a new technology is keeping the stories of the Holocaust alive for the next generation. And hope for Iraq, how one woman is fighting radical Islam with faith and hope. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell, coming to you from a beautiful sunny day here in Jerusalem with the walls of the old city behind me. But several thousand miles from here, the people of Nepal are suffering after one of the worst earthquakes in years, and aid for Nepal is coming from all over the world. Israel sent more than 250 military rescue and medical personnel to help the country in the wake of the worst earthquake to hit the country in 80 years. The Israeli search and rescue team, including dogs trained to locate survivors under the rubble of collapsed buildings. The Israeli military's field hospital will be able to treat at least 200 patients a day. It's equipped with about 95 tons of humanitarian medical supplies from Israel, along with a staff of 122 doctors, nurses, and paramedics. It also includes emergency and operating rooms and pediatric neonatal departments. The Jewish state has one of the top disaster relief teams in the world. Joining me to talk more about the situation in Nepal and Israel's response to it is Julie Stahl. Julie, how do you explain Israel's response to natural disasters like what happened in Nepal?
Well, you know, Chris, Israel is very generous. They're very willing to give. They're very experienced in disaster relief, also from their war experience here and other things. So they give what they have. As we noted that they've sent by far the more people, more manpower, more doctors and nurses than any other country.
That's an amazing statistic. Israel's one of the smallest nations in the world, yet sent most of the rescue personnel in the world. Is this all part of Tikkun Olam, fixing the world, trying to help people in need?
It's part of the Jewish spirit, part of the generous spirit, part of trying to help your fellow man and make things better. And that's definitely what Israel's doing.
And there were a lot of people, a lot of Israelis in Nepal when this happened, and yet they responded with Haiti when there was just a few years ago when there's hardly any Israelis there.
That's true. I mean, Israel didn't need to send a field hospital to Nepal in order to rescue Israelis from a trekking trail. So, you know, the people that have said that, oh, well, it's just because Israelis were there, it's not really true because the field hospital is still there and they're only missing one Israeli.
Now, switching gears just a bit, politically here, things are sort of in limbo. The election happened several weeks ago. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to form a coalition. Can you explain exactly where that's at right now?
Well, he is trying to form a coalition. He won a quarter of the seats in the Knesset, which is great, but it's not enough to have a government. So he has to cobble together enough parties. He's on the way to doing that. I think all the parties have kind of made their demands, and it's a question of which parties he can talk into or out of their demands to join him in a government.
How would you explain this to a U.S. audience? You know, when the election is over there, the election is over, but now when the election's over, there's a lot of things happening. And what are some of the demands that some of these parties make on Netanyahu?
That's true. In the States, when the election's over, everybody breathes a sigh of relief or whatever. They get on with business. Here, they have to form their government, and that's when the wheeling and dealing starts. That's when things can get complicated. There are two parties. One of them that will probably join the government is demanding that Netanyahu make a strategic decision to remove Hamas from power in the Gaza Strip. Another party is demanding that Netanyahu promise not to halt settlement construction in what the rest of the world calls the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. So those kind of things also are figuring in. It's not just who's the health ministry or the interior ministry or whatever. Those kind of demands are also on the table.
Well, it's a fascinating political drama to go ahead and see unfold, and thanks for your expertise about Nepal and the government, and we'll see what happens. On another issue facing the Jewish people, it's been 70 years since the liberation of the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, and the number of Holocaust survivors is dwindling. But a new technology is keeping their stories alive for the next generation. Paul Strand has that story.
Sisters Rena and Danka Kornreich survived almost all of World War II together in Nazi death camps. In fact, Rena was on the first trainload of women sent to Auschwitz, fooled into thinking it was just a short-term work camp.
297 teenagers are on the first transport. 50 are dead in the first 6 months.
Rena's Promise documents how the sisters kept each other alive and helped many others. A key part of their survival, refusing to dwell on the reality of the daily gassings and killings going on all around them.
She does see the SS pour the Zyklon B into the gas chamber, and she's on a work detail where she can see that. She never goes on that work detail again. She can't. She realizes that to see that is her spirit to die.
Rena rose above it all after the war by putting Hitler and the Nazis behind her. She wholeheartedly embraced life and gave it, like to her only daughter, Sylvia.
Apparently, when I was born, my mother was just elated. And, we've heard stories that she, felt like this is the revenge on Hitler.
The Nazis did at one point steal Rena's faith as she watched them march hundreds of little orphans into the gas chambers.
About 500 children, and they're holding teddy bears, and she prays.
As she begged God to stop the horror, a Nazi guard got right into her face.
SS Hassa came up to her, spit in her face, and said, "Where is your God now?" And that's the moment when Rena lost her faith in God.
She also witnessed the Nazis kill off beautiful Jewish women, including her friend Adela Gross.
They selected 2,000 healthy, young, beautiful women for the gas. Adela was healthy. She's red-haired, gorgeous young woman. And Rena watched her go to the gas.
It took decades, but Rena regained her faith as she saw thousands inspired by her book.
And how the story is helping them to believe in survival, to believe in love, to believe in the strength of the human spirit.
And she said, "There's only so much room in my heart, so I don't hate. I love. To hate is to let Hitler win."
Rena and Donka ended up in America and remained close for some 50 years before Rena passed away in 2006. Donka died 6 years later, but their story is now chronicled forever.
When you hear 6 million Jews and 10 million people total, that's such a phenomenal figure that it's very hard to put that into the reality of what happened there. And by having all the individuals that we can now tell stories about, including my mother and my aunt, that makes it real.
These stories and those of other survivors keep this tragic part of history alive in the hope that it will never be repeated. New generations can better learn about the Holocaust through a new app produced by these men called Sacred Ground. Recording studio owner John Keel says the app transports users to Berlin's Holocaust Memorial.
And there are these little stones that you start walking through, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger until you're walking through these tunnels. And the message being is that this is how this kind of evil overtakes us. It grows until we're trapped.
We've all seen those horrifying images from the Holocaust, the skin and bones bodies stacked high like cordwood. What's important to remember is that each one of those bodies represents a life lived fully and richly before the Holocaust.
It needs to be about the lives that they led and remembering that they were just like me and just like you until someone declared that they were not. And it's not a declaration that can be made.
You can also hear Baltimore Rabbi Moshe Dov Shawali talk about his own family's horror.
My name, Moshe Dov, is after my mother's dad, Moshe, who was murdered in the Ukraine in front of her when she was 16 and he was 46.
He said the Holocaust, or Shoah, made him feel like a victim, and he wanted to rise above that by rituals that would consecrate the millions of lives snuffed out. Cantor Emanuel Perlman hopes the ritual prayers and music he and his co-producers put on this app will allow millions to memorialize those survivors and victims on every Holocaust Remembrance Day.
There had never, ever been, to my knowledge, any special prayers that were composed, written for the Holocaust.
Perlman grabbed up his first grandchild, Abner Judah, to point out how he hopes this app will serve the future.
He'll be able to understand history in the way in which we see history from generation to generation.
Then this proud new grandpa just rejoiced at this bundle of joy in his arms. It is important to remember the Holocaust, but also to have an antidote to it. Living fully, giving life, celebrating all it has to offer. Paul Strand, CBN News, reporting from Baltimore.
Up next, a Middle East expert explains the historic changes going on in the region. Jonathan Spier is the director of the Rubin Center at the IDC Center in Herzliya. He's a Middle East expert and we talked with him in our studio about the historic changes going on in the region. Jonathan, thanks for being with us on Jerusalem Dateline. You wrote an article recently about these historic changes in the Middle East. What do you see happening now in the region?
Well, I think what we're seeing, we've witnessed in the region now over the last half decade, is essentially the collapse of a number of states inwards into themselves, and the replacement of strong centrally governed regimes by a whole series of kind of would-be successor entities that are doing battle over the ruins of two states, the two states in question being Iraq and Syria. But we also have a similar process now opening up further south. We can't see it on the map here in Yemen.
Yeah, and are we seeing a lot of it between the Sunnis and Shiites, which would be Iran representing the Shiites, and then Saudi Arabia and others representing the Sunnis?
Precisely so. In other words, you have the collapse of states, you have the emergence of successor entities, and then you have these entities, usually on a sectarian basis, Sunni and Shia, finding patrons who can help them in their war effort, with the Shia finding assistance from Iran, and with the Sunnis finding assistance also from Saudi Arabia, but from a number of other potential backers as well. It can be Turkey, it could be Qatar.
Right. For those that need to know, what is the difference between the Shiites and the Sunnis, and why is there such animosity between the two?
Well, this goes back to the foundation of Islam itself. When Muhammad, who created a state, so to speak, down in the Hijaz, down in what is now Saudi Arabia, died, there was effectively a battle over the succession between two factions. And the faction which represented Muhammad's direct family was around Ali. And it's called the Shi'at Ali because Shia in Arabic means faction. And so it was effectively not a doctrinal battle, but it was a battle over who would hold power in that state that Muhammad created. The Sunnis won, the Shia lost, as a result creating two rival traditions of Islam.
And I know you also made the point recently of a historic change of a Sunni coalition gathering to fight in Yemen against the Houthis, which are backed by Iran.
What we've seen in the region over the last half decade is that the Iranians have been very well organized, very centralized, with clear clients all the way across the region, whether it's the government dominated by a pro-Iranian party in Iraq, the Assad regime in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis we were talking about down in Yemen, a clearly centralized bloc, all organized around Iran. But the Sunni element was far more disunited, far more confused. And what we've seen as a result of initiative taken by the new Saudi king, King Salman, is an attempt, relatively successful up until now, to finally create a united Sunni alliance to deal with the threat of Iranian advance across the region as they see it.
What about the U.S. foreign policy? What impact has it had on the region lately?
Yeah, well, the feeling which all of us have is that the Obama administration wants and wanted out of the Middle East.
Groups like this, there's only one option.
New firm commitments in the region. And as a result, really, of that American absence, I think we're seeing two things. First of all, the Iranians feel enormously emboldened and are therefore pushing a whole variety of conflict arenas forward. And the Sunnis feeling very confused and afraid, not having the American patron around anymore, were flailing about for a long time and are now, as you mentioned in Yemen, beginning to organize themselves, understanding that the Americans are not going to be around to do it for them, to organize themselves to try to resist the advance of Iran, which we were talking about.
Well, we're seeing enormous historic changes,
Absolutely.
like you said. Appreciate your expertise and analysis, Jonathan.
Thanks, Peter.
Up next, one woman faces death while speaking out for the truth about Islam. Listen to this quote. Muslims are normally good people just like everybody else, but when they read the Quran, they turn into a killing machine. The woman who said that knows what she's talking about. She's a former Muslim herself, who's now facing death threats for speaking the truth about Islam. Dale Hurd brings us her powerful story from Sweden.
This woman is on a mission. She's not a Muslim, and her Muslim dress is a disguise. Her mission is for Muslims to know what is in the Quran, because she says if more Muslims knew what was in the Quran, more would leave Islam. Mona Walter came to Sweden from Somalia as a war refugee when she was 19. She says she was excited about joining a modern European nation with equal rights for women. But as a young Muslim woman, that was not the Sweden she encountered.
I discovered Islam here in Sweden. In Somalia, you're just a Muslim. You're just born into Muslim country without knowing the Quran. But when you come to Sweden, then you go to mosque. And there's a Quran, so you have to cover yourself, you have to be a good Muslim.
Walter says she grew up in Somalia never having read the Quran.
So I didn't understand what I was part of. I didn't know who Muhammad was. I didn't know who Allah was. So when I found out, I was upset.
She says she discovered that Allah is a God who hates and that Islam is not a religion of peace.
It's about conquering. Muhammad, he was immoral. He was a bloodthirsty man. He was a terrible man. And they can read that in his biography, what he did to Jews, how he raped women, how he killed people.
Discouraged, she left Islam and became an atheist, until one day a family relative encouraged her to read the Bible. She still remembers the first time she read Matthew chapter 5, verse 44, where Jesus said to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
It was very strange for me, love your enemy, because in Islam you have to kill your enemy. Kill your enemy and kill everyone who refuses Islam. But Jesus Christ, it was all about love and peace and forgiveness and tolerance. And for some reason I needed that.
She went to see Pastor Faoud Rasho, a Syrian immigrant who ministers to former Muslims in Sweden.
She started to believe, and she came to me. That was the beginning of her trusting.
I was filled with joy. Then I accepted Jesus Christ.
Mona says the Lord gave her a burden for Muslims who still do not know the truth about Islam, and she began to copy verses from the Quran and hand them out on the street to Muslim women.
I thought that if I tell them about Muhammad and about the Quran and this God of Islam who hates, who kills, who discriminates women, maybe they will have a choice and leave.
But in politically correct Sweden, Mona Walter has come under attack for simply telling Muslims what is in the Quran.
And I've been called Islamophobe and, yeah, you've been bought, you're a house nigger and stuff like that, terrible things.
She has also been called a racist. Walter warns that Islamic radicalism is a serious threat in Sweden and says Swedish society should care more about women trapped in Islam.
They will think like, oh, we're in Sweden, we have a freedom of religion. We don't have freedom of religion. It's not for Muslim women, it's for everyone else.
She lives under death threats and sometimes travels with police protection. She wanted to show us Muslim areas around Gothenburg, but had to first dress as a Muslim. She believes if she were to show her face, she would be attacked.
I never go to those areas just to be in me, just to be in flesh and blood, Mona. I never get out of there alive. I mean, Muslims are normally good people, like everyone else. But when they read Quran, then they become a killing machine. This so-called ISIS or Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram, they're not extremists, they're not fanatical, or they're just a good Muslim. Good Muslim who follow the teachings of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad, he did that. They're doing just what he did.
Walter now uses videos and speaking appearances to spread her message. And she says she won't stop, even though her life is in danger. Dale Hurd, CBN News, in Gothenburg, Sweden.
Coming up, how one woman is fighting radical Islam with faith and hope. Welcome back. Heather Mercer was taken hostage by the Taliban back in 2001, along with several other Christian aid workers. But they were rescued by U.S. Special Forces after the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan later that year. Now Mercer is back in the Middle East, this time with the Kurdish people in northern Iraq. But it's not the Taliban, but ISIS that is now threatening their way of life. As Wendy Griffith reports, Mercer's fighting back with a campaign called Hope for Iraq.
Heather Mercer is used to serving on the front lines of war. Here she is just 200 feet away from ISIS fighters. You can see their black flag flying over this water hut. She and her staff from Global Hope were there to offer aid, encouragement, and prayers to the Kurdish soldiers fighting ISIS. Sadly, just 3 weeks after this photo was taken, this soldier and 60 others were killed in one of the deadliest battles with ISIS so far, in the exact spot where Mercer had visited.
Are you feeling the effects and seeing the effects of ISIS in where you are?
Yeah, we are in some ways. You know, the Kurdish region has done a good job trying to maintain a relatively secure space, but ISIS is there. We know that ISIS is there. And, you know, we're less than an hour from the front lines, and there's not a Kurdish person, a Kurdish family that hasn't been affected by the conflict. They're sending their troops to the front lines every day, and many of them are losing their lives.
In response to the unprecedented suffering, Mercer recently launched a campaign called Hope for Iraq.
People need just basic food, shelter, you know, their daily needs. People need education. Right now we have 500,000 children that are sitting idly in camps because they are not able to go to school. So we need to address education.
Mercer says a big focus will be helping support and restore women in crisis.
So right now there's over 3,000 women who are being held captive by ISIS, and literally they have no place to turn. So we're focusing on ways to help rescue and restore them.
How can people in churches help? I know you're reaching out to churches.
Absolutely. We're looking for at least 100 churches that would join us in this campaign, sharing it with their people and their congregations, and then asking businesses as well. This is a humanitarian crisis, and everybody has a place to play a part.
Any concerns, any fears? I mean, you've already been through a hostage situation and were rescued. I mean, any fears about, you know, living and working among the Muslims in Iraq during such a time?
That's not the question I want to ask. The question I want to ask is, what's God's heart, and where would he be?
Right.
And I believe Jesus is walking the streets of these towns and villages that so desperately need him. And where he is, that's where we want to be.
Wendy Griffith, CBN News.
Mercer's story and Israel's relief efforts in Nepal are some of the good stories coming out of the Middle East. Well, that's it for this edition. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.